During the Cold War, the two global superpowers often fought each other via proxies. The Soviets bled us with the North Koreans and North Vietnamese, and we returned the favor whenever possible, such as our support for the Afghan Mujahedeen. It was often messy, but it worked. We fought at a remove in other people's homes, but so long as they refrained from attacking us on U.S. soil, and we refrained from attacking them on Soviet soil, both sides were willing to put up with a lot from the other. However, there was an exception to the no direct attack on each other's soil in 1950, when American warplanes attacked a Soviet airfield near Vladivostok. Following are 20 things about that and other fascinating but lesser-known events from history. American airplanes accidentally violated Soviet airspace and bombed a Soviet airfield. It was the afternoon of October 8, 1950 during the Korean War. Two American Lockheed F-80 Shooting Stars, flown by pilots Alton Quanbeck and his wingman Al Diefendorf, were flying a mission over North Korea. Their target, Chongjin Airfield, on the far northeast of North Korea, 40 miles south of China and 60 miles southwest of the Soviet border. It was an overcast day, and skimming the top of the clouds at 37,000 feet, they armed their .50 caliber machine guns in preparation for action, and began their descent. At 10,000 feet, they spotted a small hole through the clouds, and plunging through the opening they found themselves over a broad river valley with mountains to each side. Following the river, they proceeded southwest, in a heading they thought would take them away from Soviet and Chinese borders. Unfortunately, they had strayed into Soviet airspace. That was bad enough, but then things got worse when they bombed a Soviet airfield on Soviet soil. Look at that airfield, it's loaded. Targets and resistance had been scarce in the days preceding his mission, so F-80 pilot Alton Quanbeck was surprised to see the flashes of anti-aircraft guns from a small town nearby. Soon thereafter he spotted a truck on a dirt road, and heard his wingman Al Diefendorf urge, "Let's go in and get it." An instant later, Diefendorf spotted a juicier target, and exclaimed, "Look at that airfield, it's loaded." As Quanbeck described it decades later, it was the kind of target that fighter pilots dream about. Parked in two rows were about 20 aircraft of the P-39 or P-63 type. Thousands of them were built and flown by Americans in World War II, and some were sent to our Soviet ally. Those below us had large red stars surrounded by a narrow white border painted on the side of their dark brown fuselages. Overcoming doubts. Considering his airspeed, Alton Quanbeck had only a few seconds to decide what to do about the airfield below him. Between his low altitude and low-hanging clouds, he could not see more than a mile or two in any direction. Even if he could have spotted any distinctive terrain features, it was unlikely he could have related them to the crude maps carried on this mission. Quanbeck was bothered by a few uncertainties. First, no P-39 airplanes had been seen in North Korea. Second, he was not absolutely certain just where he was. Finally, the airfield below did not match the description of the Chongjin airfield he had been sent to attack. However, intelligence reports had predicted a movement of aircraft into Northeast Korea, and the markings on the plains below were nearly identical to those used by North Koreans. According to Quanbeck's dead reckoning, he had hit the coast well south of the Soviet border, so he overcame his doubts and decided to attack. Strafing the airfield. As Alton Quanbeck described the attack, I positioned our aircraft for a strafing pass on the northern line of aircraft, then made a sharp, banking turn to the left and fired on the southern line. I could see tracers carving through the aircraft, and knew we were getting lots of hits, but there were no explosions. On my last pass, I decided to make sure of one clear kill. I concentrated my fire at one plane and saw it start to burn. D followed me closely in each pass. We exhausted our ammunition and were down to minimum fuel, 400 gallons. Time to go home. As I pulled off the target, turning right to our homeward course, I saw an island off the coast. Oh, I thought, there's no island near Chongjin. However, after comparing notes, the two pilots assured themselves that, while they had not attacked Chongjin, they had struck an unimproved airfield at Regin, 40 miles north of Chongjin and 20 miles south of the Soviet border. South of the border versus north of the border. As Alton Quanbeck and his wingman Al Diefendorf reported in their debriefing a few hours later, they had destroyed one airplane and damaged two others. Several months later, an intelligence officer assigned to Far East Air Force HQ told Quanbeck that the airfield burned for a week. Apparently, the planes they left burning must have triggered secondary explosions, which reached other planes. The attack was a great tactical success. Unfortunately, it threatened to turn into a huge disaster. You'll either get a Distinguished Service Cross or a court-martial out of this mission. Later that evening, Alton Quanbeck and Al Diefendorf were summoned to headquarters by their commanding Major General, Earl E. Partridge. They went over the mission again. Then Partridge laid out a large map pointed to an area within the USSR southwest of Vladivostok, and asked if it was possible that they had attacked there. There were significant terrain similarities, but while Quanbeck thought it was possible, he did not think it was probable. He was wrong. As they left, General Partridge told the pilots, "You'll either get a Distinguished Service Cross or a court-martial out of this mission." It's hit the fan. The following day, when Quanbeck returned from a mission, he was met by Diefendorf, who informed him, "It's hit the fan." Instead of crossing the coast well south of the Soviet border the previous day, the duo had done so well to the north. Rather than attack an airfield on North Korean soil, they ended up attacking Sukhaya Rechka, a Soviet airfield on the outskirts of Vladivostok, nearly 80 miles north of the border with North Korea. Understandably, the Soviets were quite alarmed, unclear whether the attack was a mistake or a deliberate provocation that presaged the outbreak of World War III. The following day, October 9, 1950, the Soviet government presented an official note of protest to the United Nations. An international firestorm. Back in Washington, President Truman held Douglas MacArthur responsible. He suspected his troublesome commander in Korea of deliberately attempting to provoke a war with the Soviets. The story became front-page news, but both the Soviet and U.S. governments, each for its own reasons, preferred to de-escalate and put the incident behind them. On October 19, America's ambassador to the United Nations admitted the attack and informed the UN Secretary, "The commander of the Air Force Group has been relieved, and appropriate steps have been taken with a view toward disciplinary actions against the two pilots concerned." The pilots were tried before a court-martial, but in a proceeding that was closed to the public, both were found not guilty. The findings were not released by the Air Force, which wanted both the Soviets and Truman to assume that the airmen had been properly punished. However, neither Alton Quanbeck nor Al Diefendorf were permitted to fly any more combat missions. The teenager who became the first African-American musician in the Civil War. The 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, depicted in the movie Glory, was formed during the Civil War. 14-year-old Alexander H. Johnson of Boston enlisted as a drummer boy. The 54th Massachusetts being one of the Union Army's first colored regiments, young Alexander was likely the first African-American musician to enlist in the Civil War. He saw significant service. He took part in the battles of Honey Hill, Boykin's Mill, James Island, Olustee, the Siege of Charleston, was present at the murderous assault on Fort Wagner, and participated in Sherman's march through the Carolinas. Alexander's drum was struck by enemy fire 6 times, and he was wounded in the leg. He stayed with the 54th Massachusetts until war's end and his discharge in 1865, when he returned home with the drum he had carried at Fort Wagner. A drummer for life. After the war, Alexander H. Johnson settled in Worcester, Massachusetts, taught drumming and founded that town's first drum corps. Nicknamed Major in reference to his being the drum major of the town's drum corps, Alexander settled down and raised a family of 17 children. He was a lifelong active member in the Grand Army of the Republic, as well as a member of the Sons of Union Veterans. In 1897, a memorial sculpted by Augustus St. Gaudens was unveiled in Boston, in honor of the 54th Massachusetts and its colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, who died fighting at the regiment's head during the assault on Fort Wagner. Erected in front of the Massachusetts State House in Boston, it depicts Colonel Shaw and his regiment leaving Boston for the South. Alexander is depicted with his drum, tapping the beat at the head of a column of his comrades. He lived to the age of 83 and died in 1930. The fighter that swept the Japanese from Pacific skies. American naval aviators began the Pacific War with a rude shock. They were unpleasantly surprised to discover that their standard fighter airplane, the F-4F Wildcat, was outclassed in many ways by the faster, more maneuverable and longer-range Japanese Zero. Ameliorative operational procedures and tactics were adopted to counter the Zero's advantages and play up to the Wildcat's strengths. However, such measures were a stopgap at best. What was really needed was a new and improved fighter. They got it in 1943 with the arrival of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which ended up wreaking havoc upon the Japanese. Enter the Hellcat. Even before America joined World War II, Grumman had been working on a successor to the F-4F. The company sped things up after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and took what became the F-6F Hellcat, from the experimental stage to operational employment in a mere 18 months. It featured folding wings for easier storage, thus allowing aircraft carriers to carry a greater number of fighters. The Hellcat was faster, more powerful, more maneuverable, and longer range than its predecessor. It outclassed the enemy's Zeros in every way except maneuverability at low speed. It saw its first combat in September of 1943, and proved so successful that by 1944, it had become the Navy's standard carrier-based fighter. 12,275 Hellcats were produced during the war, and they were the main platform which the U.S. Navy used to clear the Pacific skies of enemy planes. The Ace Maker. The versatile and rugged Hellcat spearheaded America's advance across the Pacific. They conducted fighter sweeps over enemy airfields, flew combat air patrols to shield the forces below from aerial attack, and performed ground attacks in support of soldiers and Marines. Standard armament was 6.50 caliber machines, but some planes substituted a pair of 20mm cannon for two of the machine guns. F-6FS could also carry a pair of 1,000-pound bombs. Its most destructive load for ground attacks, however, were half a dozen 5-inch rockets, whose salvos exceeded a destroyer's broadside. Although it did not enter service until the final 2 years of the conflict, the F-6F Hellcat downed 5,156 enemy aircraft, nicknamed the Ace Maker for the seeming ease with which its pilots achieved that status. With 307 Hellcat pilots becoming aces during the war, the plane achieved an enviable 19:1 kill ratio, and accounted for 75% of the U.S. Navy's air-to-air victories. Britain's Afghan debacle. Britain and Russia spent much of the 19th century jockeying for influence in Central Asia, in what came to be known as the Great Game. The Russians sought to pursue their version of Manifest Destiny by expanding into the region, while the British suspected the Russians of coveting India, and sought to keep Tsarist borders as far away as possible from Britain's most prized imperial possession. When in the 1830s an Afghan ruler became too friendly with Russia for Britain's tastes, the British invaded Afghanistan in 1839. They deposed its Russophile ruler, replaced him in Kabul with a British puppet, and garrisoned the Afghan capital and key cities to keep their new pet ruler in power. Things initially went well. The British made themselves comfortable in Afghanistan, and it seemed only a matter of time before the country was annexed to British India. However, the Afghans proved obstreperous, and Britain's puppet ruler proved incapable of controlling the country. It ended in catastrophe for the British. 19th century Afghan insurgents. By 1841, discontent had flared into open revolt, with Afghan tribes rebelling against the British and their pet ruler. As the countryside was lost and supply lines to India were cut off, British control first shrank to the garrison cities, and eventually the British found themselves in control of little more than the grounds of their fortified garrisons. So the British sought a face-saving measure to extricate themselves from what had become an untenable situation. They deposed their puppet ruler, dusted off the ruler whom they had unseated in 1839, and reinstalled him in power in exchange for a promise to control the Afghan tribes long enough for the British to evacuate Afghanistan and withdraw in peace. Whether the reinstalled ruler deliberately betrayed the British, or simply lacked the influence to control the tribesmen, things went sour. A disastrous retreat. A British column of 16,000 soldiers and civilians set out from Kabul on January 6, 1842. They were barely a mile beyond the city before they began to take sniper fire from the surrounding hills. By day's end, emboldened Afghan tribesmen were dashing in and out of the column to loot the supply train and butcher whoever they could lay their hands on. That night many froze to death as the column camped in the open without tents. The following day, some Afghan leaders arrived and demanded that the British halt while they tried to ensure the safety of the route ahead. They extorted a large sum of money, negotiated a British agreement to withdraw immediately from all of Afghanistan, and demanded that they be given officers as hostages. The following day the British resumed the march, by which point many of the soldiers had become too debilitated by the cold to fight. As they entered a narrow pass, the column was fired upon by tribesmen ensconced on the rocks above, losing 3,000 casualties. Extermination of a British army. Over the following days, the Afghans shook the British down for more money and more hostages, in exchange for empty promises to rein in the tribesmen. On January 11th, the British commander and his deputy were forced to surrender in exchange for yet another promise of safe passage. Soon thereafter, the British found their path barred, this time for good, by entrenched Afghans who had blocked and fortified a pass. A desperate charge was made to try and break through, but it was beaten back. On January 13, 1842, a week after setting out from Kabul, the last few survivors formed a tiny square and made a last stand. Later that afternoon, British sentries in Jalalabad, on the lookout for the arrival of the Kabul garrison, saw a single rider approaching. It was a Dr. Brydon, the sole survivor of the British retreat from Kabul. The first steppe terrors. For millennia, nomads from the Eurasian steppe, including the likes of Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, and Tamerlane, terrorized the settled peoples on their borders. Centuries before those figures became bywords in barbaric destruction, they were preceded by the Scythians, a nomadic confederation of Iranian peoples inhabiting the steppe, between central China to the east and the Carpathian Mountains to the west. Controlling an overland trade network that connected the Greeks, Chinese, Persians, and Indians, the Scythians created the first steppe empire that terrorized its neighbors. Starting in the 7th century BC, the Scythians began raiding into the Middle East. Their first major disruptive role was the taking of a leading part in the destruction of the Assyrian Empire in 612 BC. Defying Darius the Great of Persia. In 513 BC, Persia's king Darius I sought to end Scythian raids on his empire by conquering the Scythians. Assembling a huge army, he launched an invasion along the western Black Sea coast and into today's southern Ukraine and Russia. The Scythians simply retreated into the vastness of the steppe, taking their families and herds with them. Avoiding the decisive pitched battle Darius sought, the Scythians laid waste the countryside, blocking wells and destroying pastures, while attriting the invaders with skirmishes and hit-and-run attacks. A frustrated Darius challenged the Scythians' king, Idanthyrsus, to stop fleeing and fight. Else, he should admit his weakness and submit, recognizing the Persians as his lords. The Scythians did the equivalent of telling Darius to go fly a kite. Go weep. The Scythian king's response to Darius' challenge to either stand and fight or submit highlights the difficulty in bringing turbulent nomads to heel by forcing them to fight against their will. As reported by Herodotus, King Idanthyrsus wrote, "This is my way, O Persian. I have never fled in fear from any man, and I do not flee from you now. We have neither cities nor cultivated land for which we might be willing to fight with you, fearing that they might be taken or ravaged. As for lords, I recognize only my ancestors Zeus and Hestia. As to you calling yourself my lord, I tell thee to go weep." Darius had to give up and turn back, his invasion amounting to little more than an expensive and fruitless demonstration. Scythians were still raiding the Persian Empire centuries later, until its destruction by Alexander the Great, and continued to raid Persia for centuries after that.